Myself in a minute. Hi there, BJ.
Hey Steve, how are you?
I'm doing okay. We're into our warm weather here, so now it's actually it's been cold for here. We had a hot summer, now we're having a cold fall. So it's like, wait a minute, where's all this stuff that we're supposed to be living here for? But yeah, it's a 48 degrees right now, but it'll be up in the 70s, and not it's a desert. We get warm fast.
Sean Manzi always tells me that once you start talking about the weather, the conversation is over.
Well, that's pretty much how we start every week. So there you go.
We'll see you later.
Yeah, it's been great. Oh, and Dan's trying again. So I'll tell you what,
Good.
I'm going to put him in the green room, and I am going to take us to our four-person view, which
Good.
looks like this. Frozen
Hey,
Dan.
that's all
So,
right. You shouldn't be frozen yet. It's pretty decent weather out there right now, I think. Or maybe
yes.
that was the first cold day. I don't know.
I don't know. In the upper Northeast, it's like 45 and raining. So I don't know what Dan's got down in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, it was we had 70 degrees last week and then the next day it was 30 and
It was
I don't
70
know.
degrees yesterday. Last 2 days have been 70 degrees.
Yeah, so here it comes. Now you're going to get the nasty stuff.
Yeah, I think we're pretty lucky to have 70-degree weather in November in New Hampshire. I feel like that's
Must be.
not a normal
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, but
Must be.
New Hampshire's where we're all supposed to move to avoid global warming. So, real estate values will be going up.
They don't need to go anymore. I've already gone up plenty.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah. So I dragged these two guys in, sort of short notice, but it's a topic that I've wanted to talk about some, um, which is experience with a big, quote unquote, big club. And we probably have to define that some. When I was on the board in Wisconsin, we had somewhere around 130, 140 clubs. Um, there were probably, I'd say there were one, two, three, four, maybe a handful of clubs that I would say were quote unquote big, where they had um, three or they had threes teams or fours teams or maybe even a fives in a case or two. The other hundred and some clubs all had maybe a ones or ones and twos. Some didn't even have, they might have 14s, 16s, 17s. They might not have 18s or might not 15s or something. Um, so a lot of people, I at least I have the sense where I'm at, and I don't know where you guys are, but I have the sense that a lot of clubs are fairly small compared to the mega clubs that are out there. And I just want to kind of talk through the differences, maybe what the goals are, how they separate teams, and how tryouts vary. I mean, I know a lot of places that don't have tryouts. They have a sign up, and they just sign up the 12 or 15 kids and they do whatever they can with them. So That's what I was interested in talking with Jim, because I know both Jim and Dan have experience with clubs that are a little bit bigger than that. We could get into and another great person to talk to about this would be Katie Charles. She works out in Sunshine in Southern California, out of somewhere in the LA area. I'm not exactly sure if it's Los Angeles proper, if it's one of the other suburbs, but I know that'd be another good resource on this topic. But yeah, that's where I want to go. So I don't know, Jim, do you want to tell us a little bit about you? You're in New Hampshire now, but you used to be down in the DC area. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I've actually spent time at, I'll say, a significant amount of time at a couple different clubs. Down in DC, the majority of my time in Northern Virginia was spent with a club called American Volleyball Club. I got there the year after it started, and ended up having about 70 kids in it. 7 teams. The older teams, there was one per age group. The younger teams, there was a couple. Prior to moving to Northern Virginia, I was in Connecticut, and I spent 10 years at a club called Husky Volleyball, and that was a pretty substantial size club. So when I left there, the club was give or take 500 kids, and it was growing borderline around 400 for the girls and about 100 for boys, and that number's actually grown since then. So I've kind of seen both sides of it. The current club I'm coaching at now, gosh, I want to say it's about 60, might not even be that big, 60 kids. So it's kind of a wide variety of it.
More on the smaller side at 60. I mean, we have, a lot of the clubs here are that 60 range, but the mega clubs are the ones. I mean, that's just what I'm, because I think so few people are familiar with that. It sounds funny because there are there are a lot of teams in those clubs, but I think there are a lot of people that just have never experienced what that's like.
Yeah, Husky was an super interesting club because while it was a large club, and they certainly tiered it between their local teams and their travel teams. Their local teams still traveled, but their travel teams were set up so that there were actual tryouts. You had to, take the best 10 kids, best 12 kids at each age group. First team gets the best 10, second team will get the next best 10, etc. But the local teams were a lot more interesting to run because there was a lot more of them, but that club had no cuts. So to your point, it was both you had to do tryouts and you were doing a sign up all at the same time. So it was kind of interesting, but it kind of exponentially grew. And as you look through it, the challenge of finding coaches, gym space became real interesting for a while. There's a bunch of challenges that came out about that because when your stated goal is you're never going to cut a kid, you have to all of a sudden figure out where you're going to put all the kids and how do you get them with somebody who is as good of a coach as you can find.
That's Pat Ryan's club, right? Husky?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So Jim and I have one of those weird volleyball circles where Jim and I met in Colorado, even though neither one of us are from there. We met doing Cap 3. A guy that I was playing with for 15 years or so was also playing with Pat Ryan, who's a VCT member, and Jim was working for Pat Ryan. So we found out that one of those little weird volleyball circles all the way across the country.
Yeah, Pat's as a player is kind of obnoxious because when he was in his late 50s, he was still better as a setter than most people that were in their 20s just getting out of college. I mean, I can't even fathom how good he must have been when he was in his 20s. So it's
and he's still that good. He's
I know
playing
gosh, dude doesn't age.
Yeah, he's definitely in his 60s, and he's playing 50s because he doesn't want to play with the so-called old guys. Yeah, that's really something. So that's probably the bigger of the clubs that you've been with.
Oh, by far, yeah. Like I said, that one when I left, it was, and when I was my last few years there, I did a couple of things. I was the director for the boys side of the house, and then I was an assistant director for the high performance teams. So I coached one of the girls' high performance teams. So it was probably, again, the boys were about 100 kids. The girls' high performance, there were, oh gosh, call it 7, 8 teams. I forget exactly now. So there's somewhere between 70 to 80 kids that were in that part of it. And
Wow.
then the rest of it. So it was, tryouts are interesting, right? Because you have 100 kids in an age group that you had to figure out. And it became interesting because you started going through and you do all these things for tryouts. You go out and you figure out how to get metrics on people, how you understand who they all are, understand where they fit, what would be a good position for them, like what are they good at, what aren't they good at. And then all of a sudden they get down to they're in the local program and all that goes out the window because they need to be in the same carpool as somebody else. And they might be like literally 4 or 5 teams apart. So all of a sudden it becomes a little bit of not a free for all, but a little bit more interesting when you have that.
Don't you feel like, and as long as we have Dan, I'll ask him. Dan, when you're in a tryout situation like that, where you've got 40, 50 kids, all, hoping to be on that one's team, don't you feel like the first 5 or 6 kids you can pick out in about 5 minutes? And then it's hard to get the next 4 or 5.
Yeah, I think you can get the top probably 10-20% of those kids right away, and then you're kind of figuring out how those pieces all fit. Because inevitably every year the top 10%, like the top 5 players in the gym are setters, or the top 5% are middles. So then you have a whole bunch of really good middles, but you don't have setters to go with them, or you have pins and you don't have defense. So that's I think the really really tough part. In our area, we're so spread out in Pennsylvania that our big clubs aren't nearly as big as what you guys compete with. So then it becomes a really issue. Like you're literally calling other clubs like, hey, we have middles, but don't have centers. What do you have? And kind of playing the game a little bit. Ironically, and I'm sorry I'm late. Like I'm literally at my daughter's tryout, and I'm like in the worst possible place, the worst lighting, the worst Wi-Fi. So it's like it's miserable. But yeah, like so we're going through it, and I think that's a struggle that the big clubs have. I think when I started and we were doing small clubs, like you knew who your 10 players were. Like you formed the team because you had 10 players that wanted to play together. And now it's this big business and you're trying to figure it. It's almost like the NFL combine.
Yeah, Jim, tell us a little bit more about Husky. Like you've got 100 kids trying out for a bunch of teams. How do you even go about starting to split them up in the gym during the tryout? I mean, you must have to start sorting them. That's a horrible way to say it, but it's what has to happen,
No,
right?
it's not. So to Dan's point, not only can you tell the top 10%, 20%, sorry, my cat just pushed something off my table. Not only can you tell the top 10 or 20%, you could also just as quickly tell the bottom 10 or 20%.
Right.
And as awful as that is, that's just the reality. So then now you're evaluating that middle 60%, right? So we were lucky in that back then, this is before Pat had his own facility. The gym the school that we used had 5 courts. So even with 100 kids, you could still break it up into manageable numbers. And the things that we used to try to figure out is how do we do it by position? And you certainly know me. You know how I try to do everything as humanly possible, as game-like as possible. Yeah, tryouts are not like that in any way, shape, or form. Tryouts are about, can I get you 10 reps so I can evaluate those 10 reps, and how does that compare to everybody else's 10 reps? And when you look through that, how do you compare people? And how do you make sure that all of your outsides are measured against each other effectively? How do you make sure all of your middles are measured against each other effectively? One of the neat things that I did, I started, oh gosh, I don't even remember when I first did it now, but it was doing the USAV tryouts for their camps and for their HP stuff, because it gave you an organization and a structure behind how do you get through a boatload of kids and make sure that you have good metrics on all of them and you could understand what they were and who they were. And that was super important. And that certainly helped me get a lot more organized as we started getting through some of these bigger numbers. To be honest, I still do it that way. because I want to make sure I want to make sure I see every kid pass 10 balls. I want to make sure I see every kid pass or hit 10 balls. I want to make sure I see every setter set 10 balls. I want to make sure I see everybody block 10 balls. Just get those baseline things so that then you can take that, factor that in, weigh that in appropriately to what do they look like when they then play. Right? We all know great warm-up players, and then all of a sudden they start playing, and you're like, oh my gosh, you should never ever be involved with this game. So you have to kind of weigh those two things out and use it. But it becomes a baseline, right? If I have two kids that are relatively equal, and I hate to say this, one looks better when it's they know what's going to happen, then that person probably makes it. It's the same thing with like vertical testing. I hate to say that, but a lot of times I think vertical testing is used as factors in way too heavy. Vertical is great, but at the end of the day, I care who's a better player. If you have two people who are incredibly equal, yes, take the one who jumps higher. But you can jump a foot lower, and if you're better, fantastic. I'll take that over somebody who jumps a foot higher.
My experience at adversity was interesting because Mike would just have him play, basically play speedball for most of the time, or some equivalent, and then you might start with twos, you might start with threes, you might throw a setter in so you could see the setter. And you had coaches kind of rotate from court to court, kind of looking at individual players and seeing what they could do, and it worked pretty well.
So my challenge to that is when you have coaches moving from court to court, evaluating different things in different players, are the evaluations going to be equal weighted? So let's say Dan and I are both measuring something. If I measure passers incredibly harshly, and I'm going to do that, my passing numbers are typically real tight, but Dan's a little bit more forgiving. Everybody who I measure is going to all of a sudden, we'll call it a 1.8, 1.9. Dan's average might be a 2.3, 2.4. Passing isn't any different. It's just how do we measure it? And if you try to combine that all into one, all of a sudden that number is skewed. So when you do those tryouts, I think that any time you're measuring a position or you're measuring a player, you need to make sure it's one coach or the same two coaches that are evaluating the entire group of those players so that you're getting the same baseline. Otherwise, it's going to play into biases.
Well, that assumes you use numbers. And
even if you use the eye test.
Well, but when you get, it depends on your approach. Our approach was to bring the coaches together and go, what do you see? And then start putting people together and seeing, so it was an iterative process as opposed to an absolute process. So I'm not saying it's better or worse. I'm just saying, hey, you asked about club experience. That's how we started our tryouts.
That's
with
how
kids playing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's actually something. I mean, I've always experienced it in the club world, but we rarely ran into that when I started running the Beach HB program for USA. I'm evaluating players in Virginia Beach, and then I'm flying out to Manhattan Beach, and my coaches in Manhattan are weighing things and evaluating. A kid that's a 5 out of 5 in Virginia Beach is like a 2 out of 5 in Huntington or Manhattan, because we didn't have the same staff traveling. That was one of the big things I said. Like, if we're seriously want to grow, this at the national level, international level, we have to have the same evaluation staff going to all these cities. We can't trust. We can have the local coach doing it. And I think, Jim, you brought up the great point. That was when I was still running one of the clubs here. That was one of the things that we did, was making sure that the evaluators were always the same, and the coaches would kind of walk through and migrate and see. But from a number standpoint, it was the same people giving the numbers all the time.
Yeah, it was. It's funny. There's a weird. God, I wish I could remember where it was. It was somewhere in It was in Philadelphia, so it was at the NEQ. But one of the kids that was in the camp that was in the tryouts, she was an A1 kid. I mean, just a dynamite libero, just fantastic. So all of a sudden, there was a bunch of other liberos that were in that same group with her, and they realized, oh man, this kid's real good. So now all of a sudden, they started playing well above their level because they were trying to match up to the other person. And it was just wild to see. And it was just something where those 4 other kids all of a sudden blew their numbers away because they were trying to match up to somebody who they have no realistic hope of being even comparable to. But it's real neat. It's the one time I've ever seen numbers completely just get blown out of the water because there's no way those kids were that good. But they were just fighting so hard to go after the one kid they knew was hands down the best. So it was real fun to see.
Yeah, and Dan has brought up a couple times, just not to kill tryouts as a topic, but we continue to talk about. I know the four of us talk about the mental side of the game, and how important that is. The tryout a lot of times is mostly based on physical things, and I'm pretty sure it was Dan talking about what else can we do in a tryout situation that's going to evaluate some of the mental side of what we can expect from players. Am I right about that, Dan? Is that something that you've brought up in the past?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it's just like anything else, and obviously I'm biased towards the mental side of stuff, but we have these tryouts and we do all the physical stuff, but when we pick the teams and it becomes mid-season, what breaks down and what causes the issues, and how do we get a glimpse into how they're going to do, and like one of the things that I go back and forth on, and I'm not sold either way on this argument, is are parents allowed in the gym during tryouts? And the argument's always, well, parents make them nervous or whatever. But then my flip side of that is, well, they're going to be playing in front of their parents mid-season. So, and I don't know the answer, unfortunately. I don't know. When I first started in club, one of the bigger clubs that I worked with, they did like a whole sat down and interviewed every player. Now, at that time, they were getting maybe 100 kids at tryouts. Now you're getting 200, 300 kids, so it's really hard to do that. But my thought was, well, what's that interview going to tell you? The kid's just going to tell you what they think they want to hear, and the coaches aren't trained. So even if they say a kid has, attention issues, what's the coach going to do different because they're not used to that? So I don't know what we can do to find value and also find a metric or a way to put them in those positions to see how they'll handle it in a one-day situation. Now,
Dan, we probably both know a bunch of student sections from colleges we can bring down, and that'll help a lot. See what happens to the kids when they're there.
Right. Now, I will tell you, I'm working with a club as a consultant right now, and they have boys and girls. And on the boys' side, they had, I think, almost 500 kids try out across all ages. And I think they're fielding 22 teams, 23 teams. But this is the first time I ever saw it done this way. They send you an invite or an offer to the club, and then you're part of that club for almost a month, and then they decide what team you're on. So like you go in as a 15 and you try out, and they take 100 15s because they're going to field, 5 teams or 10 teams, whatever they're going to do. And then you practice for a month almost, all intermingled, all everything. And then they say, okay, you're on our 15-1s, you're on our 15-2s, you're on our 15-3s.
We did that.
And it blew me away because first I'm like, what parent goes along with that? But once they conditioned, like, this is how we do it. And when you start now this club did really, really well at nationals for AAU, but like so did their twos. So like I think they had from their ones to the fours, all teams in like the gold semis, final, like they were legit. Now obviously different levels, open, national, all that. But like even their threes teams and four teams were competing for national championships at their level. And
well, yeah, but they cut half of the people who tried out, so that kind of gives you a more select group that you should have good starting place at least.
Well, I think
right.
That's but Dan, to your point, I think that's an awesome way to do it, right? Because now all of a sudden you're not only playing based on skill, right? Because most 1 and 2 teams, your bottom half, top half of those 2 teams, your skills are overlapping, right? Your top half of your 2s teams, very often their skills are as good as the bottom half of your 1s team. But now all of a sudden, by doing it after a month, you're able to see how people interact, what are their personalities like, what coaches might they do better with, how do they respond to feedback better, how do they respond to different stimuli better. And now you're making the team based on that, so you avoid all the problems that derail most teams in 6 months because you just pick these 10 kids because they're the best 10 kids, not if they can even get along. That's real interesting.
And you very
And
quickly know the parents who are going to interfere.
yeah, and I think part of the region, like where they're located, has a lot to play in it. Like in the Keystone region in Pennsylvania, we have a waiting period, and we can't even, like today are tryouts. They can't even make offers for 4 days to the players, and then the player has 4 days to accept. There with this club, it was at the end of tryouts, we're going to make you an offer to join our club, and you literally have 2 hours to decide. And they did it, and they're successful at it. But I don't know how you would do it if you had to follow all the rules that we had to do, because that's a lot of kids. And again, it goes back, like one of the things I like about the waiting period, like forget the fact that kids have to decide where they're going to go and what offers they're getting. If you run, and this is a big one for you, if you film your tryouts, that 4-day waiting period gives you a chance to go back and review that film and get more watch. But I think too many clubs, like the club I'm at now, while my daughter's trying out, it's just guys walking around, coaches walking around and evaluating. No one's filming. But if I have a 4-day waiting period where I can't make offers, I'm filming that, and then I'm going to have my coaches watch it. Do we miss anything? Here's court two, but that's a whole other rant and complaint. But I think that we just try to get these kids through almost like cattle. Like, hey, let's get through the tryouts and pick the ones we want and move the other ones on. That we're not really evaluating. We're just trying to pick out who's the best and hopefully they work together as a team.
Well, one piece to go beyond that is we do not design our tryouts as an experience for the parents and for the players. We design it for us. And
sometimes.
Yeah, most times. I mean, I've been with 4 clubs. They're not designed to give the player a great experience. Because if we really went and interviewed players and parents and said, what are your challenges with this? We're not meeting a lot of them. And again, you're right. I'm sure there's some clubs out there, a few anyway, that do that. And we should find out what they're doing and, copy it at least to start. But I don't think there's a lot of thought given to that. It's, it becomes a little bit intimidating for the girls or boys, depending on what season you're on and all of that.
The other thing for me with that is I want it to be like, let's say you're charging $50 or $30. I want it to be like, man, even if I don't make a team, that was a really good $50 clinic. That was a really good $50 camp, and otherwise, like, hey, I'm paying you to have the honor of getting a number, like to try out. I at least give them something that if they don't make the team, like, okay, I worked really hard and I know what I need to work on versus standing in line, serving 20 balls, and all of that.
That's very much how I ran the tryouts that I did, the 4 or 5 years that I did them. Never with really large groups. Usually, I think the largest groups that we maybe had were 35, 40 kids. I wanted to make sure each kid walked out of there with something that they knew they needed to work on. Why was it that I couldn't make this team? What do I need to do for next year on my high school team? Or what can I do to make this this club team? And whether it was by demonstrating them their weaknesses on the floor, or just by talking with them and saying, hey, look, here's a couple things that if you could do better, I think you'd have a better chance. I ran them much more like clinic days than like the cattle call. But I think you're right. It's much more, like Jim was saying, it turns out to be in a lot of places more like an NFL combine. And I don't know. It seems unfair to the kid, but
I think there needs to be both of it, though. I think you do need to have a little bit of that, again, just so you can get a baseline on it, and then it becomes how do we build that experience? How do you go there and get them playing, right? And so with Husky, we used to do it over the tryouts would be over the course of 3 days, so we'd have it over 3 different weeks. So what would happen is we'd go through. First one would be a little bit more of the positional evaluation, and then the next 2 would basically be all playing. How do we understand how to play? How do we get people in the right position? How do you move people up and down so that they feel like, hey, these are the people I should be playing with, so I understand what level I'm at. And then that also made making your teams a little bit easier, because now, if you're a 16-6 coach, you're not wandering around looking for the one kid on this one court. In theory, you're pushed, the kids are in the right place in front of you, so you can kind of move it around and get to the right kids and evaluate those kids.
I think you bring up a good point on that. Are we doing a disservice to the players if we're trying to be nice and keep it mixed up, as opposed to making that hard decision, say, no, you need to go to court 4 and you stay on court 1. I feel like sometimes we need to rip that Band-Aid off and just say, here's where you are, go to court. Everyone knows that court 4 is the lower, so that you get them where they need to be. But I think too many people are afraid to have that conversation, because if I move you down to court 2, you're going to leave. You're going to leave our trial and go to another club.
Well, what also happens is, I think we treat kids at times like they're not smart, and they are. They're incredibly smart. They understand, if you're a kid who belongs on a fours team and you're all of a sudden running on a top court, they understand they're a fish out of water. And to your point about experience, it's not going to be fun getting smoked by 11 other people, and you are the one who's causing all the problems because you can't hold up that end of it. So it's not just about, trying to get all the right kids to that court. It's also getting that kid in a place where they can have some success. Because if you're an attacker, if you're an outside hitter, and you are by far the weakest player on a court, now all of a sudden you're playing a game, you're an outside, so by definition, you're probably going to be getting 30% of the sets in your one position. And you can get exactly 0 kills because everybody else is well above your level. Man, that's not fun. That's terrible. So how do you get them to the right place, and then they can feel like they're having success, and then they can understand that, because they recognize, hey, this is where I was doing it. I wasn't doing great here. I moved down. And, I think it just helps to get people close to the right place to give them a much better experience of playing. So
I think that makes a lot of sense. On the other side of it, it is helpful at times to see your elite players and see their reaction to having a weaker player on the court with them. Because there are those who get frustrated, and that's not a good thing, because they'll get frustrated when they're with a group of peers who are slightly less capable. So, but I do think in general, going the, segregating and moving people where they're going to wind up helps them, and also helps their parents. Because there's a parent going, oh, but I could take this club and they'd be on the ones team, and that's what they want. They want ones. It's like, okay, if a kid's got to have ones, find them a club, no matter what level, that they're going to have ones in, because otherwise they're going to spend the whole year carping, which leads me to the next piece, which is, let's move into the club coaching experience after you get the team you get, because you're not going to get the team you want.
You mean after all the restless nights waiting for the offers to come back? And
like when I had 12 kids, and then they said, well, we got an odd number, we got to add 2. Now you got 14, and then another kid comes on and they say, oh, now you got to have 15, and figuring out how to make that work, because it's a challenge, and a lot of us hit it, and some would go, oh my God, 15? That was one of the best teams I ever coached. But it took a little bit at the beginning.
But you were probably honest at the beginning of it, and I think for me that's the key. My last year when I was coaching 17, we had 3 really good setters that we only wanted 1, maybe 2 as a backup, but we weren't sure. Everyone's trying out at 10 different clubs, so we made offers to all 3, playing the percentages that someone would say no, and all 3 would say no. So the very first thing I did is said, look, here's my vision. And for this to work, you guys need to buy into it. I'll get you guys reps, and we'll train the heck out of you. But I think a lot of other coaches would have played, we'll do it. And then each day you're kind of like, no, hold on, we'll sub you in a little bit, and then that little bit never happens. I think every aspect, especially in club, and it still happens even at the college level, is honesty. You have to be honest up front, or it's going to be an absolute nightmare for you the whole season.
Well, Dan, that's a fantastic point. It's not. People are in general. People are okay, and athletes are okay when they understand what their role is and what their expectation is within that role, and without having that open conversation and an open dialogue, be it collegiately, be it club, be it high school, doesn't matter. If that person doesn't know what their role is within the team, they don't have one, and they're going to feel like they don't have a worth to that team. So how do you drive that conversation, especially now when you're seeing a lot of college teams having mandatory minimum numbers on their roster. So all of a sudden, roster numbers are just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Where it used to be 12 to 14 kids, and now it's not uncommon to see 20-person rosters. How do you build that expectation so each one of those 20 people knows what their role is? Because that is how you avoid all those problems. That's how you avoid 3 kids that are all in the same position, instead of them being just cutthroat and wanting to, hope somebody sprains their ankle, or do give
Well,
somebody a time
play
to heart to bust their knee. Like, those are the things that you're able to avoid by having that great conversation. That's just an incredibly important thing.
played the 3-minute interview with Annie Drews after she came on that match. That, to me, I just when I saw that, I'm like, I have got to change my approach. I've got to be clearer with roles, because here's a player who knew her role was a star on the bench, waiting for that moment, and comfortable with it, because she knew and had agreed to her role, which was, you bring energy when we need it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I had that this year on our team. A D spec coming in as a freshman this year, and really good. Made it like to the state championship game. A really small school. But when we recruited her, I said, look, I have really, really good liberos and D specs, and I need someone like you that's going to push them. But I can't say how much, if any, playing time you're going to see in the jersey. But what we will do is we are going to develop you. We will push you. But I'm looking for someone that's going to be an amazing teammate on the bench and work hard in the practice gym to then get rewarded with that. And I can honestly say I don't know that I've ever had a better teammate player than her this year. She probably played maybe in 5 matches out of the 28 we played. But every single play, she was cheering everyone on. She was engaged. She was excited. And when we had our end of year meeting last week, I said, "Are you okay?" And she said, "Yeah," because we had that conversation. When I accepted to come play for you, I knew what my role was going to be for the first 1 or maybe 2 years. But because we talked about it, I'm absolutely okay. So, and you worry, right? You're recruiting players. You're like, if I tell them, "Hey, you might not play for a year or 2." There's 475 D3 schools. They'll be like, okay, I'll go somewhere else. But the fact that she, agreed and it worked out, it was a tough conversation to have on the recruiting process.
Let's pivot to what a season looks like. Again, at a lot of the smaller clubs, they exist to have players just get some more playing time. They might go and play in the region championships, or they might take one big overnight trip or something like that. But when you are on a large club team that's chasing a bid, or that you've got 2, 3, 4 Division I players on your team, and you need to go get those players seen, what is that? What is that season like? How does that season fall? Like, just a general description of what the schedule is like.
It is a grind, just an
That's
absolute grind.
That was literally the word I was going to use. In a single word, it's a grind.
So when I was down in Virginia, again, smallish club, 70 kids, give or take, but it was the last couple of years, the couple teams that we had were both very solid. One of them had a finish. I think we finished the last 3 years I was there. A team finished, I think it was 5th at the NEQ, 3rd at the NEQ, and then one other team we ended up finishing like 25th at nationals, or 23rd at nationals, something along those lines. As you start traveling around, it's every weekend, and it's pressure every weekend, because every time you go somewhere, you're going against people with like minds and like thoughts. So now all of a sudden you're running into teams where they also have a bunch of Division One athletes. They also have a bunch of people who are trying to get seen. Um, so it becomes pretty interesting when those things happen. And we've all probably had stories like this when you go into some of these big tournaments and crazy stuff happens. And this is when I was a much younger coach. This is one of my favorite stories ever. I was down at the NEQ, and the club I was at, Husky at the time, we got seeded into open for some reason, or got put into open, and probably didn't belong there. Probably just should have been in national, whatever it was called back then. And we're going in and we're warming up, and all of a sudden we're warming up, and I look around, and there's like all sorts of big time Division One coaches there. I mean, just tons of them. And I'm like, what is going on here? Like, what's happening? Why are these people here? We were playing some club from North Carolina they had never heard of. Turns out it was Megan Hodges' club. And needless to say, that did not go very well for us. So there's always scenarios like that happens, but it's a grind. It's every weekend. You're away 2-3 weekends a month at overnight tournaments. You're perpetually going out there. It's a sacrifice for the kids. Like, they are giving up a huge portion of their high school experience because instead of them hanging out and going out with their friends, they are out traveling. So it's I just can't think of any other word other than a grind.
Yeah, and it's really, really hard to adjust and train once you're in that move. Like, I felt like regional and local teams, we got a lot of good trainings. The big ones when we were traveling to qualifiers every week and everything, it's like you get shellacked, and what are you going to do? Because you only have 1 day, maybe 2 days, because then you're right back on the road doing a 3-day. And it's just really, really tough. And it's so stressful for everyone. Like, being on the flip side now with a parent, like, it's a nightmare. Like, getting my kid to these places, getting everything set. Like, I try to do everything for her, not because I'm that type of parent, but because I just want her to focus on playing for that weekend. But some of these kids are so independent. Like, they're the ones booking the travel. They're the ones figuring things out. I think that there's just not a lot of thought put into that. People want to chase it, and they want to sell their club by saying, hey, we're going to all these qualifiers. We're playing these big ones. They don't realize that it's probably actually hurting the athlete if you're being realistic about the level of play for your club.
No.
It's funny. I had a different experience with it. And I just lucky, I guess. One, I haven't coached club in 5 years, so things may have changed. And I know in this region, there's a lot more weekend tournaments during the year. Most of the tournaments, at least before I left the Midwest region, Great Lakes, were Saturday or Sunday. And so as a coach and a player, they were local. They were, you went to qualifiers, and qualifiers were always stressful. And I had a couple teams where we went to National Open Division, and to be honest, there were 14 boys teams, which was I think a little easier. My first team was really talented and really tough to coach, and my second team was a set of overachievers who got probably the last bid in the country. And I said, guys, the good news is you got a bid to Open Division. The bad news is you got a bid to Open Division. We're gonna be shelled for a couple of days, but you're gonna get a great experience, and that's kind of how it turned out. But I didn't see as much the logistical challenges, and I didn't see that week to week cutthroat competition that you would see at 18 competing for Open Division, because I just didn't. I wasn't coaching at that level. I was coaching a 2 or 3s team most of the time, which is just so it's a different experience. But for coaches who might be in that situation, it might not be quite as challenging from a competitive stress every week. You're always trying to get better, but the expectation of parents that if they don't go to Open Division, then it was a failure of a year isn't as much when you're not coaching the ones team for your age level.
Yeah, I think, Dan, to your point, I think one of the things that I really liked about that grind, and I think as a coach helped me a lot, is it really got me to focus in on we need to be really good at what we were good at. because we couldn't try to go at it. Right now, man, between every match, we have, 4 days to prepare for that other coach who we've been playing against every year for maybe twice a year for the last 10 years. So we know each other's tendencies. We know what the other team wants to try to accomplish. So now it becomes more of just a slugfest and like these crazy weird adjustments. Whereas in club, it was you're playing best out of three. You are running at it hard in that first set where it literally just becomes we just need to focus and be really, really good at what we're good at, and then hope a minor little change at best is what we're going to be able to do to move past it. So that was actually pretty fun. But it also helped me conceptually understand you need to be able to make adjustments on the fly that you can practice and that you can know what they're going to be to try to change it. Like if you understand, my offensive transitional scheme is X and that's not working, I need to have a backup plan to that. Otherwise, I'm just going to be in trouble. So things like that were fun, but I don't know. It's still just a grind. It's a different grind, but it's still a grind.
I think you bring up a really good point about doing what better well. For me, club is all about the 80-20 rule. You know what I mean? Like, the only way you survive in club isn't bringing up the bottom of your bar. It's continuing to raise the top of your bar and taking what you're good at and making you really good at it versus trying to look at this. They took us to task plan as well. So you can't focus on that. We have to do what we're good at and do it much better. And I think that's a big change that the coaches have to make.
It's funny you say that, Dan. I use this with my corporate executives coaching all the time, and I have not used it in volleyball, but I have a mentor of mine who asked me, he said, the 80-20 rule? I said, yeah. He said, okay, what if you could apply it twice? Do the math. I'm like, okay, so 4% of my efforts will get me 64% of the result. And he goes, yeah. So would you like that deal? I'm like, yeah. So figuring out how to do the 4%, but also how to get rid of the 96% is the key. But that even hyper focuses you on what do you do extremely well and how do you get to that more often. I'm gonna ponder that a little bit as I get ready for my boys' high school season.
Yeah, I mean, if you're my college team is a prime example. We are not known for our offense. Our typical year is we hit like 189, and that's like a good offensive year for us. But we usually are at tops on the defense. So I would rather move our defense up, and maybe we'll hit 190, 195. It's not a big jump offensively, but because we're focused on our defense, because that's what we're good at, it wins us those games. It keeps us in the game. I think too many people look at that 180 and like, no, we need to be in the 200s. I mean, of course, I want to be in the 200s, but this time to research. I think too many in the club world, because of how it's scheduled, typically you have 2 practices. You get the kids for 4 hours a week, and then you're traveling. Focus on this is what we did really bad, so we have to fix that. And they put aside the stuff that they're doing really well, and that's actually what they should focus on for at least 2 of those 4 hours.
So just to lay out a season, like a typical season kind of schedule, tryouts in most regions, I think, are still happening October, November. We're going to play mostly as a club in December. Maybe there's an early season tournament or two. January, a lot of local or friendlier tournaments. By February, we're already starting the national qualifier season. The first couple are in February. Then they go February, March, April. There might even be one in May, although that's getting pretty late. And somewhere in there, most clubs that are playing at that level also have to fit in their regional qualifier so that if they're not making an open, they get their shot at a national or American bid. So they're starting that season in November, end of November probably, going hard until end of April, early May for sure, and then the open is in late June, early July. So they're spending almost the entire off season of their high school. I don't know if there is an off season anymore. They're spending until halfway through the summer in that grind that you're talking about. That just mentally and physically has to be exhausting.
After my last trip to nationals in DC in Virginia, I had 3 weeks off before high school tryouts started in the fall because they
Yeah.
started like the first week of August, and we ended. We're like the second wave of nationals, so we ended at the tail end of that first week of July, and it's just 3 weeks is not a lot of time to recoup and get your mindset turned around between having 2 hours a week or 4 hours a week and getting it up to 12 or 16 hours a week.
Yeah, and the other part of that is at some point, probably around May, definitely June, July, there's overlap, right? Your kids are practicing for club nationals, but then high school is running summer open gyms. So then you're dealing with, and that's just a whole nother, Lord, that's a whole nother podcast topic because
Yeah.
rarely the philosophies and the training for the high school do not match the club. So how do you have a kid going from super high elite on Tuesday to high school on Wednesday, flipping that switch? That's just a mind mess as well.
You
And
also
we've only
have
got a
the
couple of minutes left.
yeah.
So the last thing I just want to hit on, and without giving away any secrets or naming any names, I guess, what are some of the I guess a two-part question. One is, what's the fee that you're hearing now that kind of blows you away for a kid to play? I know what the top ones are in Wisconsin, but I'll keep that to myself for now and let you guys answer. And then, what's the hidden cost to a family? They're going to have to write a check out for X amount of dollars to the club, but then there's also a bunch of hidden cost dollar wise for that family to cart their kid around.
Um, I'll hop in first just because I actually just looked at these numbers, and I'll come from a parent standpoint this past year. Our dues for a national team, but we didn't fly anywhere, we only did qualifiers in the area. Our dues were $2,400. Our uniform was $150. But when I turned my stuff over to my accountant, out of pocket for us, everything was probably around $8,000 between dues and then food, hotels, travel, gas, all that. And the argument is, well, your kids are going to eat anyway. Well, they are, but they're not going to eat $5 tacos at a convention center. There's that cost. But yeah, I would say out of pocket once everything's said and done, just for the club aspect, not counting training, weight training, all that stuff. Probably about $8,000 for our season.
Right. Jim, what are you hearing?
I was gonna say the club that I currently coach for, we are probably more of a local club. We'll play one qualifier because it's fairly local to us in Boston, and then we'll do a bunch of AAU weekend tournaments, and our club dues are $1,200 a year. So it's and it's purposely set up like that because they don't want it. They just don't want money to be a barrier for entry. I know down south in the Northern Virginia area, it was not uncommon to see club dues anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000, and that was 7 years ago. So I can only imagine those have probably gone up a pretty significant amount since then. And then, of course, you got to pay forget about the hotels for your kids, because a lot of times the hotel for the kids are covered in that dues, but it's the hotels for the parents that they have to then go out and get. And it's the potential airfare. It's, all of a sudden your family's going out to eat 4 times in a weekend. It adds up. And a $5 taco, I'd be excited to find anything $5 in a convention center to eat. There's not a chance there's anything that's $5 in most of them. So it's
well, and that I don't want to use the word Ponzi scheme, but that how you brought it up is exactly how things changed when things started to creep up. Like, oh, we might actually have to start charging $3,000, $4,000. It just took things out. Like, for example, all the clubs that are here no longer cover the kids' hotel rooms. They're not part of the dues. because their argument was, well, they could stay with their parents. Well, I mean, I still got to pay for that. Like, that's still part of what we're doing. So even though it's not part of the dues, I have to pay for it out of pocket. But it makes the dues look like, they're a little bit less.
Here's the other thing we didn't talk about. Every one of us, I'm sure, remembers we used to not have to pay to get into tournaments. You used to be able to just roll into national qualifiers, and there was no fee for it. There's no entry fee to get in there. And now all of a sudden for a weekend, people are paying, what is it, 30, 40 bucks to get in there for that weekend. God forbid you want to actually watch it streamed. It's, probably more than the 30 or 40 bucks. So it's just, again, another cost, because when you're doing 8 convention center tournaments and you're paying for 2 people to go to each one and it's 30 bucks each, that's going to add up to another chunk of money.
Yeah, my experience in Midwest clubs, I would say, and I haven't been there in a long time, but the better clubs, you're probably paying somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000 for club dues. You're not getting airfares, not included. You stay with your parents. And by the way, if I'm a club director, my kids are staying with their parents. I am not putting 4 kids in a room and chaperoning them. It's just not worth the hassle.
I don't want the responsibility for the kids.
Well, right. Exactly. And it's, it's just, I saw it done for a while at one club and I'm like, oh, forget that. There's just no way. And so once we started doing parents, a lot of problems went away. Occasionally you had the parent whose kid got segregated from the team but you dealt with that. And at the end of it, and then you're talking about, we are in how do I monetize this world right now? So no matter what it is, somebody's trying to figure out how to monetize it. And the classics are admission to, you're paying club dues and you're paying, to get it in at the gate to watch your kid play at your own club. That's
the one that bugs me, is that I've paid, if my club's hosting a tournament and I've already had that parent pay me, some amount of dollars, then I'm going to charge them to come into the gym to watch their kid play. I mean, holy cow. That just feels wrong to me.
And then if you've ever seen the heating bill for one of the, the converted warehouses where they play, you kind of go, all right, I kind of get that, but
But that's still cheaper than renting out a gym space somewhere else in most places.
Yeah. Oh,
sometimes.
Yeah.
That's the wild part of it.
All right, we got to cut it off because these guys got to go, and so do I. But Steve, let's wrap it up. Thanks, both of you guys. I think there was some really good insight, hopefully for coaches, about playing on, doing something maybe that a lot of them haven't done before. They're just getting a glimpse. But Steve, what do you have for the end?
I think for all the coaches, especially newer coaches watching, you've heard a lot of different experience, primarily the kind of the ones team kind of experience. And that's a good thing to know about at your club. Every club runs things a little differently. And we didn't talk about kind of the operations. Hey, did you as a coach your team the way you get to coach it at your club? Or do you have a master coach who runs the first 90 minutes and you get 30 minutes with them doing what you want to do? All of those things come into play. For a newer coach, that's not a bad thing to have in the beginning, but down the road, when you have your own ideas about how you want to coach, you might want to be thinking about how the club treats that, because I've been on both of them and I know which one I prefer, but your mileage may vary. Dan, thanks for being with us. We'll talk soon on another topic. And Jim, it's always great. I'm still having my kids have the conversation before the point on serve receive. They still don't quite get it, but we're getting there.
It's the best way to do it.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll see you all next week. Thanks for being with us, and out we go.